Hello, hello, hello. Good evening, and welcome to another exciting episode of Mr. Kessler Reads. Tonight, we're going to finish chapter 4 of the Graveyard Book by Neil Gaiman. Um, in the beginning of the chapter, Bod goes in search of a witch's grave, and when he meets her, he kind of falls for her. He's got a little crush on her. So now he's on a mission. He's got to get her a tombstone, gravestone, so that she can mark where she's buried and put her name on it. And this is kind of frightening because Bod's never been out of the graveyard. So let's see what happens. Clothes. He would need clothes. His usual dress of a gray winding shirt was, he knew, quite wrong. It was good in the graveyard, the same color as the stone and its shadows. But if he was going to dare the world beyond the graveyard walls, he would need to blend in there. There were some clothes in the crypt beneath the ruined church, but Bod did not want to go down to the crypt, not even in the daylight. While Bod was preparing to justify himself to Master and Mr. Soames, he was not about to explain himself to Silas. The very thought of those dark eyes, angry or worse still, disappointed, filled him with shame. There was a gardener's hut at the far end of the graveyard, a small green building that smelled like motor oil, and in which the old mower sat and rusted, unused, along with an assortment of ancient garden tools. The hut had been abandoned when the last gardener had retired, before Bod was born. The task of keeping the graveyard had been shared between the council, who sent in a man to cut the grass and clean the paths once a month from April to September, the local volunteers and the friends of the graveyard. A huge padlock on the door protected the contents of the hut, but Bod had long ago discovered the loose wooden board in the back. Sometimes he would go to the gardener's hut and sit and think when he wanted to be by himself. As long as he had been going to the hut, there had been a brown working man's jacket hanging on the back of the door, forgotten or abandoned years before, along with a green stained pair of gardening jeans. The jeans were much too big for him, but he rolled up the cuffs until his feet showed. Then he made a belt out of a brown garden twine and tied it around his waist. There were boots in one corner, and he tried putting them on, but they were so big and encrusted with mud and concrete that he could barely shuffle in them, and if he took a step, the boots remained in the floor of the shed. He pushed the jacket out through the space in the loose board, squeezed himself out, then put it on. If he rolled up the sleeves, he decided it worked quite well. It had big pockets, and he thrust his hands into them and felt quite the dandy. Bod walked down to the main gate of the graveyard and looked out through the bars. A bus rattled past in the street. There were cars there and a noise and shops. Behind him, a cool green shade overgrown with trees and ivy. Home. His heart pounding, Bod walked out into the world. Ebenezer Bolger had seen some odd types in his time. If you owned a shop like Ebenezer's, you'd see them too. The shop in the Warren or streets or in the old town of antiques, an antique shop, a little bit of junk shop, a little bit pawnbrokers. Not even Ebenezer himself was entirely certain which bit was which. Broad, odd types and strange people, some of them wanting to buy and some of them needing to sell. Ebenezer Bolger traded over the counter, buying and selling. Needed a better trade behind the counter and in the back room, accepting objects that may not have been acquired entirely honestly, and then quietly shifting them on. His business was an iceberg. Only the dusty little shop was visible on the surface. The rest of it was underneath, and that was how Ebenezer Bolger wanted it. Ebenezer Bolger had thick spectacles and a permanent expression of mild distaste, as if he had just realized that the milk in his tea had been on the turn, and he could not get the sour taste of it out of his mouth. The expression served him well when people tried to sell him things. Honestly, he would tell them, sour faced, it's not really worth anything at all. I'll give you what I can, though. as it has sentimental value. You were lucky to get anything like what you thought you wanted from Ebenezer Bolger. A business like Ebenezer Bolger's brought in strange people. But the boy who came in that morning was one of the strangest Ebenezer could remember in a lifetime of cheating strange people out of their valuables. He looked to be about 7 years old and dressed in his grandfather's clothes. He smelled like a shed. His hair was long and shaggy, and he seemed extremely grave. His hands were deep in his pockets of a dusty brown jacket, but even with the hands out of sight, Ebenezer could see that something was clutched extremely tightly, protectively in the boy's right hand. "Excuse me," said the boy. "Aye, aye, Sonny Jim," said Ebenezer Bolger warily. "Kids," he thought. "Either they've nicked something or they're trying to sell their toys. Either way, he usually said no. Buy stolen property from a kid, and the next thing you knew you'd have an enraged adult accusing you of having given little Johnny or Matilda a tenner for their wedding ring. More trouble than they was worth, kids." "I need something for a friend of mine," said the boy, "and I thought that you could buy something I've got." "I don't buy stuff from kids," said Ebenezer Bolger flatly. Bob took his hands out of his pocket and put the brooch down on the grimy countertop. Bolger glanced down at it. Then he looked at it. He removed his spectacles. He took an eyepiece from the countertop and screwed it into his eye. He turned on a little light on the counter and examined the brooch through the eyeglass. "Snakestone," he said to himself, not to the boy. Then he took the eyepiece out, replaced his glasses, and fixed the boy with a sour and suspicious look. "Where did you get this?" Ebenezer Bolger asked. Odd said, "Do you want to buy it?" "You stole it. You've nicked this from a museum or somewhere, didn't you?" "No," said Bob flatly. "Are you going to buy it, or shall I go find somebody who will?" Ebenezer Bolger's sour mood changed then. Suddenly he was all affability. He smiled broadly. "I'm sorry," he said. "It's just you don't see many pieces like this. Not in a shop like this. Not outside of a museum. But I would certainly like it. Tell you what, why don't we sit down over tea and biscuits? I've got a packet of chocolate chip cookies in the back room and decide how much something like this is worth, eh?" Bod was relieved that the man was finally being friendly. "I need enough to buy a stone," he said. "A headstone for a friend of mine. She's not really my friend, just someone I know. I think she helped make my leg better, you see." Ebenezer Bolger, paying little attention to the boy's prattle, led him behind the counter and opened the door to the storeroom, a windowless little space, every inch of which was crammed high with teetering cardboard boxes, each filled with junk. There was a safe in there, in the corner, a big old one. There was a box filled with violins, an accumulation of stuffed dead animals, chairs without seats, books and prints. There was a small desk beside the door, and Ebenezer Bolger pulled up the only chair and sat down, letting Bod stand. Ebenezer rummaged in the drawer, in which Bod could see a half-empty bottle of whiskey, and pulled out an almost finished packet of chocolate chip cookies. And he offered one to the boy. He turned on the desk light, looked at the brooch again, swirls of red and orange in the stone, and examined the black metal band that encircled it. He is suppressing a little shiver at the expression on the heads of the snake things. "This is old," he said. "It's priceless," he thought. "Probably not really worth much, but you never know." Bod's face fell. Ebenezer Bolger tried to look reassuring. "I just need to know that it's not stolen, though, before I can give you a penny. Did you take it from your mom's dresser? Nick it from a museum? You can tell me. I'll not get you into trouble. I just need to know." Bod finished his Bod shook his head. He munched on his cookie. "And where did you get it?" Bod said. "Nothing." Ebenezer Bolger did not want to put down the brooch, but he pushed it back across the desk to the boy. "If you can't tell me," he said, "you better take it back. There has to be trust on both sides, after all. Nice doing business with you. Sorry we couldn't go any further." Bod looked worried. Then he said, "I found it in an old grave, but I can't say where." He stopped because naked green and excitement had replaced the friendliness on Ebenezer Bolger's face. "And there's more like this," Bod said. "And there's more like this?" "There," Bod said. If you don't want to buy it, I'll find someone else. Thank you for the biscuit, Bulger said. You're in a hurry, eh? Mom and Dad waiting for you, I expect. The boy shook his head, then wished he had nodded. Nobody waiting. Good. Ebenezer Bulger closed his hands around the brooch. Now you tell me exactly where you found this, eh? I don't remember, said Bod. Too late for that, said Ebenezer Bulger. Suppose you have little think for a bit about where it came from. Then, when you've thought, we'll have a little chat, and you'll tell me. He got up and walked out of the room, closing the door behind him. He locked it with a large metal key. He opened his hand and looked at the brooch and smiled hungrily. There was a ding from the bell above the shop door to let him know someone had entered, and he looked up guiltily. But there was no one there. The door was slightly ajar, though, and Bulger pushed it shut. And then, for good measure, he turned around the sign in the window so it said closed. He pushed the bolt shut. Didn't want any busybodies turning up today. The autumn day had turned from sunny to gray, and a light patter of rain ran down the grubby shop window. Ebenezer Bulger picked up the telephone from the counter and pushed at the buttons with fingers that barely shook. Pay dirt, Tom, he said. Get over here as soon as you can. Bod realized that he was trapped when he heard the lock turn in the door. He pulled on the door, but it held fast. He felt stupid for having been lured inside, foolish for not trusting his first impulses to get as far away from the sour-faced man as possible. He had broken all the rules of the graveyard, and everything had gone wrong. What would Silas say, or the Owenses? He could feel himself beginning to panic, and he suppressed it, pushing the worry back down inside him. It would all be good. He knew that. Of course he needed to get out. He examined the room he was trapped in. It was little more than a storeroom with a desk in it. The only entrance was the door. He opened the desk drawer, finding nothing but small pots of paint used for brightening up antiques and a paintbrush. He wondered if he would be able to throw paint in the man's face and blind him for long enough to escape. He opened the top of a pot of paint and dipped his finger. What are you doing? Asked a voice close to his ear. Nothing, said Bod, screwing the top onto the paint, dropping it back into one of his jacket's enormous pockets. Liza Hemstock looked at him, unimpressed. Why are you in here? She asked. And whose old bag of lard out there? It's his shop. I was trying to sell him something. Why? None of your beeswax, she sniffed. Well, she said, you should get on back to the graveyard. I can't. He's locked me in. Of course you can. Just slip through the wall. He shook his head. I can't. I can only do it at home because they gave me the freedom of the graveyard when I was a baby. He looked up at her under the electric light. It was hard to see her properly, but Bod had spent his life talking to dead people. Anyway, what are you doing here? What are you doing out of the graveyard? It's daytime, and you're not like Silas. You're meant to stay in the graveyard. She said there's rules for those in the graveyard, but not for those as was buried in unhallowed ground. Nobody tells me what to do or where to go. She glared at the door. I don't like that man, she said. I'm going to see what he's doing. A flicker, and Bod was alone in the room once more. He heard a rumble of distant thunder in the cluttered darkness of Bulger's antiquities. Ebenezer Bulger looked up suspiciously, certain that someone was watching him, then realized he was being foolish. The boy's locked in the room, he told himself. The front door's locked. He was polishing the metal clasp around the snake stone, as gently and as carefully as an archaeologist on a dig, taking off the black and revealing the glittering silver underneath it. He was beginning to regret calling Tom Hustings over. Although Hustings was big and good for scaring people, he was also beginning to regret that he was going to have to sell the brooch when he was done. It was special. The more it glittered under the tiny light in his counter, the more he wanted it to be his and only his. There was more where this came from, though. The boy could tell him. The boy would lead him to it. The boy. An idea struck him. He would put down the brooch reluctantly and open the drawer behind the counter, taking out a metal biscuit tin filled with envelopes and cards and slips of paper. He reached out and took out a card, only slightly larger than a business card. It was black-edged. There was no name or address printed on it, though. Only one word, handwritten in the center, in an ink that had faded to brown. Jack. On the back of the card, in pencil, Ebenezer Bolger had written instructions to himself in his tiny, precise handwriting as a reminder, although he would not have been likely to forget the use of the card, how to use it to summon the man Jack. No, not summon, invite. He did not summon people like him. On knocking on the outer door of the shop, Bolger tossed the card down on the counter and walked over to the door, peering out into the wet afternoon. Hurry up, called Tom Hustings. It's miserable out here. Dismal. I'm getting soaked. Bolger unlocked the door and Tom Hustings pushed his way in, raincoat and hair dripping. What's so important that you can't talk about it over the phone, then? Our fortune, said Ebenezer Bolger with his sour face. That's what. Hustings took off his raincoat and hung it on the back of the shop door. What is it? Something good fell off the back of a lorry? Treasure, said Ebenezer Bolger. Two kinds. He took his friend over to the counter, showed him the brooch under the little light. It's old, isn't it? From pagan times, said Ebenezer. Before. From Druid times. Before the Romans came. It's called a snake stone. Seen 'em in museums. I've never seen metalwork like that, or one so fine. Must have belonged to a king. The lad who found it says it come from a grave. Think of a barrow filled with stuff like this. Might be worth doing it legit, said Hustings thoughtfully. Declare it as a treasure trove. They have to pay us market value for it, and we could make them name it after us. The Hustings Bolger bequest. Bolger Hustings, said Ebenezer automatically. Then he said, there's a few people I know of, people with real money, would pay more than market value. They could hold it as you are. For Tom Hustings was fingering the brooch gently like a man stroking a kitten, and there'd be no questions asked. He reached out his hand and, reluctantly, Tom Hustings passed him the brooch. You said two kinds of treasure, said Hustings. What's the other? Ebenezer Bolger picked up the black-edged card, held it out for his friend's inspection. Do you know what this is? His friend shook his head. Ebenezer put the card down on the counter. There's a party is looking for another party. So, the way I heard it, said Ebenezer Bolger, the other party is a boy. There's boys everywhere, said Tom Hustings, running all around, getting into trouble. I can't abide them. So there's a party looking for a particular boy? This lad looks to be the right sort of age. He's dressed, well, we'll see how he's dressed. And he found this. It could be him. And if it is him, Ebenezer Bolger picked up the card again by the edge and waved it back and forth slowly as if running the edge along an imaginary flame. Here comes a candle to light you to bed, he began. And here comes a chopper to chop off your head, concluded Tom Hustings thoughtfully. But look you, if we call the man Jack, we lose the boy. If we lose the boy, we lose the treasure. And the two men went back and forth on it, weighing the merits and disadvantages of reporting the boy or collecting the treasure, which had grown in their minds to a huge underground cavern filled with precious things. And as they debated, Ebenezer pulled a bottle of sloe gin from beneath the counter, poured them both a generous tot to assist the cerebrations. Liza was soon bored with their discussion, which went back and forth and around like a whirligig, getting nowhere. So she went back into the storeroom to find Bod standing in the middle of the room with his eyes tightly closed, and his fists clenched, his face all screwed up as if he had a toothache, almost purple from holding his breath. What you a doing now? She asked, unimpressed. He opened his eyes and relaxed, trying to fade. Liza sniffed. Try again, she said. He did, holding his breath even longer this time. Stop that, she told him, or you'll pop. Bod took a deep breath inside. It doesn't work, he said. Maybe I could hit him with a rock and just run for it. There wasn't a rock, so he picked up a colored glass paperweight and hefted it in his hand, wondering if he could throw it hard enough to stop Ebenezer Bolger in his tracks. There's two of them now out there, said Liza, and if one don't get you, the other will. They say they want you to show them where you got the brooch and then dig up the grave and take the treasure. She did not tell him about the other discussions they were having, nor about the black-edged card. She shook her head. Why did you do something as stupid as this anyway? You know the rules about leaving the graveyard. Just asking for trouble, it was. Bod felt very insignificant and very foolish. I wanted to get you a headstone, he admitted in a small voice. I thought it would cost more money, so I was going to sell the brooch to buy you one. She didn't say anything. Are you angry? She shook her head. It's the first nice thing anyone's done for me in 500 years, she said, the hint of a goblin smile. Why would I be angry? Then she said, what do you do when you try to fade? What Mr. Pennyworth told me. I am an empty doorway. I'm a vacant alley. I am nothing. Eyes will not see me. Glances slip over me. But it never works. Because you're alive, said Liza with a sniff. There's stuff as works for us, the dead, who have to fight to be noticed at the best of times, and won't never work for your people. She hugged herself tightly, moving her body back and forth as if she was debating something. Then she said, it's because of me you got into this. Come here, nobody Owens. Took a step towards her in the tiny room. She put her cold hand on his forehead. It felt like a wet silk scarf against his skin. Now, she said, perhaps I can do a good turn for you. And with that, she began to mutter to herself, mumbling words that Bod could not make out. Then she said clear and loud, be whole, be dust, be dream, be wind, be night, be dark, be wish, be mind. Now slip, now slide, now move unseen, above, beneath, betwixt, between. Something huge touched him, brushed him from head to feet. He shivered, his hair prickled, and his skin was all goose flesh. Something had changed. What did you do? He asked. Just give you a helping hand, she said. I may be dead, but I'm a dead witch, remember, and we don't forget. But hush up, she said. They're coming back. Key rattled in the storeroom lock. Now then, chummy, said a voice Bod had not heard clearly before. I'm sure we're all going to be great friends. And with that, Tom Hustings pushed the door open, and he stood in the doorway looking around, looking puzzled. He was a big, big man with foxy red hair and a bottled red nose. Here, Ebenezer? I thought you said he was in here. I did, said Bulger from behind him. Oh, I can't see hide nor hair of him. Bulger's face apparently appeared behind the ruddy man's, and he peered into the room. Hiding, he said, staring straight at where Bod was standing. No use hiding, he announced loudly. I can see you there. Come on out. Two men walked into the little room, and Bod stood stock still between them and thought of Mr. Pennyworth's lessons. He did not react, he did not move. He let the men's glances slide from him without seeing him. I'm going to wish you'd come out when I called, said Bulger when he shut the door. Right, he said to Tom Hustings. You blocked the door so he can't get past. And with that, he walked around the room, peering behind things and bending awkwardly to look beneath the desk. He walked straight past Bod and opened the cupboard. Now I see you, he shouted. Come out. Liza giggled. What was that? Said Tom Hustings, spinning around. I didn't hear nothing, said Ebenezer Bulger. Liza giggled again as she put her lips together and blew, making a noise that began as a whistling and then sounded like a distant wind. The electric lights in the living room flickered and buzzed. Then they went out. Bloody fuses, said Ebenezer Bulger. Come on, this is a waste of time. Click, click. The key clicked in the lock, and Liza and Bod were left alone in the room. He's got away, said Ebenezer Bulger. Bod could hear him now through the door. Room like that, there wasn't anywhere he could have been hiding. He'd have seen him if he was. The man Jack won't like that. He's going to tell him. Applause. Here, Tom Hustings. Where's the brooch gone? That? I was keeping it safe. Keeping it safe? In your pocket? Funny place to be keeping it safe, if you ask me. More like you were planning to make off with it. Like you was planning to keep the brooch for your own. Your brooch, Ebenezer? Your brooch? Your brooch? Our brooch, you mean. Ours indeed. I don't remember you being here when I got it off that boy. That boy that you couldn't even keep safe for the man Jack, you mean? Can you imagine what he'll do when he finds you had the boy he was looking for and you let him go? Probably not the same boy. Lots of boys in the world. What are the odds it was the one he was looking for? Out the back door as soon as my back was turned, I'll bet. And then Ebenezer Bulger said in a high wheedling voice, don't you worry about the man Jack, Tom Hustings. I'm sure that it was a different boy. My old mind playing tricks. We're almost out of the sloe gin. How would you fancy a good scotch? I've whiskey in the back room. You just wait here a moment. Storeroom door was unlocked, and Ebenezer entered, holding the walking stick and a flashlight, looking even more sour of face than before. If you're still in here, he said in a sour mutter, don't even think of making a run for it. I've called the police on you. That's what I've done. A rummage in the drawer produced half a filled bottle of whiskey, and then a tiny black bottle. Ebenezer poured several drops of the little bottle into the larger. Then he pocketed the tiny bottle. My brooch, and mine alone, he muttered, and followed it with a bark. Just coming, Tom. He glared around the room, staring past Bod. Then he left the storeroom, carrying the whiskey in front of him. He locked the door behind him. Here you go, came Ebenezer Bulger's voice through the door. Give us your glass then, Tom. Nice drop of scotch, but hairs on your chest. Say when. Silence. Cheap muck. Aren't you drinking? That sloe gin's gone in my innards. Give it a minute for my stomach to settle. Then. Here, Tom. What have you done with my brooch? Your brooch, is it now? Whoa. What did you? You put something in my drink, you little grub? What if I did? I could read on your face what you was planning, Tom Hustings. Thief. And then there was shouting, and several crashes, and loud bangs, as if heavy items of furniture were being overturned. Then silence. Liza said, quickly now, let's get you out of here. The door's locked. You locked? He looked at her. Is there something you can do? Me? I don't have any magics to get you out of a locked room, boy. Bod crouched and peered out through the keyhole. It was blocked. The key set in the keyhole. Bod thought, and he smiled momentarily, and it lit his face like a flash of a light bulb. Pulled a crumpled sheet of newspaper from the packing case, flattened it out as best he could, and pushed it underneath the door, leaving only a corner on his side of the doorway. What are you playing? Asked Liza impatiently. I need something like a pencil, only thinner, he said. Here you go. Here we go. And he took a thin paintbrush from the top of the desk, pushed the brushless end into the lock, jiggled it, and pushed some more. There was a muffled clunk as the key was pushed out, as it dropped from the floor onto the newspaper. Bod pulled the paper back from under the door, now with the key sitting on it. Liza laughed delighted. That's wit, young man, she said. That's wisdom. Bod put the key in the lock, turned it, and pushed open the storeroom door. There were two men on the floor, in the middle of the crowded antique shop. Furniture had indeed fallen. The place was a chaos of wrecked clocks and chairs, and in the midst of it, bulk of Tom Hastings lay, fallen on the smaller figure of Ebenezer Bulger. Neither of them was moving. Are they dead? Asked Bond. No such luck, said Liza. On the floor beside the men was the brooch of glittering silver, crimson orange banded stone, held in place with claws and with snake heads, and the expression on the snake heads was one of triumph and avarice and satisfaction. Bod chopped the brooch into his pocket, where it sat beside the heavy glass paperweight, the paintbrush, and the little pot of paint. Take this too, said Liza. Bod looked at the black-edged card with the word Jack handwritten on one side. It disturbed him. There was something familiar about it, something that stirred old memories, something dangerous. I don't want it. You can't leave it here with them, said Liza. They were going to use it to hurt you. I don't want it, said Bod. It's bad. Burn it. No, Liza gasped. Don't do that. You mustn't do that. Then I'll give it to Silas, said Bod. He put the little card into an envelope he had to touch it as little as possible and put the envelope into the inside pocket of his old gardening jacket beside his heart. 200 miles away, the man Jack woke from his sleep and sniffed the air. He walked downstairs. What is it? What is it? Asked his grandmother, stirring the contents of a big iron pot on the stove. What's got into you now? I don't know, he said. Something's happening. Something interesting. And he licked his lips. Smells tasty, he said. Very tasty. Lightning illuminated the cobbled street. Bod hurried through the rain through the old town, always heading up the hill toward the graveyard. gray day had become an early night. While he was inside the storeroom, and it came as no surprise to him when a familiar shadow swirled beneath the street lamps. Pod hesitated, and a flutter of night black velvet resolved itself into a man's shape. Silas stood in front of him, arms folded. He strode forward impatiently. Well, he said. Bod said, I'm sorry, Silas. I'm disappointed in you, Bod, Silas said, and he shook his head. I've been looking for you since I woke. You have the smell of trouble all around you, and you know you're not allowed to go out here into the living world. I know. I'm sorry. There was rain on the boy's face, running down like tears. First of all, we need to get you back to safety. Silas reached down and enfolded the living child inside his cloak, and Bod felt the ground fall away beneath him. Silas, he said. Silas did not answer. I was a bit scared, he said, but I knew you'd come, get me if I got too bad. And Liza was there. She helped a lot. Liza? Silas's voice was sharp. The witch from Potter's Field. Did you say she helped you? Yes, she especially helped me with my fading. I think I can do it now, Silas grunted. You can tell me all about it when we're home. Bod was quiet until they landed beside the chapel. They went inside into the empty hall as the rain redoubled, splashing up from the puddles that covered the ground. Bod produced the envelope containing the black-edged card. He said, I thought you should have this. Well, Liza did really. Silas looked at it, and he opened it, removed the card, stared at it, turned it over, and read Ebenezer Bulger's penciled note to himself in tiny handwriting, explaining the precise manner of the use of the card. Tell me everything, he said. Bod told him everything he could remember about the day, and at the end, Silas shook his head slowly, thoughtfully. Am I in trouble? Asked Bod. Nobody, Owen, said Silas. You are indeed in trouble. However, I believe I shall leave it to your parents to administer whatever discipline and reproach they believe to be needed. In the meantime, I need to dispose of this. The black-edged card vanished inside the velvet cloak, and then, in the manner of his kind, Silas was gone. Bod pulled the jacket up over his head and clambered up the slippery paths to the top of the hill, to the Frobisher mausoleum. He pulled aside Ephraim Pettifer's coffin and went down and down and still further down. He replaced the brooch beside the goblet and the knife. Here you go, he said, all polished up, looking pretty. It comes back, said Miss Lear with satisfaction in its smoke tendril voice. It always comes back. It had been a long night. Bod was walking sleepily and a little gingerly past the small tomb of the wonderfully named Miss Liberty Roach. What she spent is lost, what she gave remains, with her always, reader be charitable. Past the final resting place of Harrison Westwood, baker of his parish, and his wives Marion and Joan, to the Potter's Field. Mr. and Mrs. Owen had died several hundred years before it had been decided that beating children was wrong, and Mr. Owens had regretfully that night done what he saw as his duty, and Bod's bottom stung like anything. Still, the look of worry on Miss Owens' face had hurt Bod worse than any beating could have done. He reached the iron railings that bounded the Potter's Field and slipped between them. Hello, he called. There was no answer, not even an extra shadow in the hawthorn tree. I hope I didn't get you in trouble, too, he said. Nothing. He had replaced the jeans in the gardener's hut, and he was more comfortable in just his gray winding shirt. He had kept the jacket. He liked having the pockets. When he had gone to the shed to return the jeans, he had taken a small hand scythe from the wall where it hung, and with it he attacked the nettle patch in the hot Potter's Field, sending the nettles flying, slashing and gutting them until there was nothing but stinging stubble on the ground. From his pockets he took a large glass paperweight, its insides a multitude of bright colors, along with the paint pot and the paintbrush. He dipped the brush into the paint and carefully painted in brown paint on the surface of the paperweight the letters E.H., and beneath them he wrote, We don't forget. Bedtime soon. It would not be wise for him to be late to bed for some time to come. He put the paperweight down on the ground that had once been the nettle patch. He placed it in the place that he estimated her head would have been, and pausing only to look at his handiwork for a moment, he went through the railings and made his way, rather less gingerly, back up the hill. Not bad, said a pert voice from the potter's field behind him. Not bad at all. But when he turned to look, there was no one there. And that is the end of chapter 5. I'm going to bed. I'm really tired. Thank you so much for joining me this evening. That was the end of chapter 4, excuse me. We've learned a little bit, but there's still so many questions. I'll see you tomorrow night. Thanks, everybody. Take care of yourselves and your families, and keep reading. Good night.